Sure, absolutely. So my name is Wil Sensenderfer. I'm the technical community manager at Rackspace, and that's my current role. I've been doing that for about 2 years, but I've been at Rackspace for almost 10. Uh, and I have used innovation games in this role, but I've also used it in many of the other roles, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Most recently, I was asked to run a innovation game for one of our community advisory councils, which was a few weeks ago, and then I've got the opportunity next week to also do the same at the Microsoft Worldwide Partner Conference. As far as how I discovered innovation games, it was actually kind of interesting. I was in a different department at Rackspace several years ago. I think it was 2007, and we were doing a project around being able to set more granular permissions for our customers within our portals. So when they log in to look at their account, there was, at that time, certain roles that they could assign to their users, but they weren't very granular. So you could either be, a billing contact or a technical contact, and that gave you certain powers. But the goal really was to be able to limit the access for certain people to certain machines, and we didn't have that capability. So we were doing a project around that to try and design that, and we had a company called ThoughtWorks come in, and they showed us a whole bunch of different techniques that they used, which I didn't realize at the time, but I would later find out were innovation games. And I got my first experience with that doing Speedboat and something they call Roles and Goals and something called Product Box. So that was my first exposure to it. And then a few years later, I met Luke and had the opportunity to take his training and figure out that, one of the things I had learned, were from his book, and I've had the opportunity to use many more of them since then. So that's kind of how I got started with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. As Wil and I were talking about the getting ready for this webinar, I realized that he's actually been familiar with and using innovation games longer than I have, and in fact, longer than a number of us folks who actually work at Conteneo. So I don't know if you are the oldest user or the longest user of innovation games, but you're certainly in that camp, based on when you were initially exposed. And for those of you who you heard him mention Luke Homan is the founder and CEO of Conteneo. But, he invented the original kind of 13 innovation games and has a book written called Innovation Games for Customer Understanding. And that came out, I want to say, like 9 years ago now. So you can still get it on Amazon if you want to read it through. An awful lot of people who use innovation games today started just by reading the book and following the instructions. What's interesting about it is that it's... we hear it all the time. Super approachable, seems really easy, and I think the book does a good job explaining that. Okay, so that kind of is, I think, a nice segue into, what are these innovation games, and what is Conteneo doing with them? And then that'll give you some context and framework so that you can understand in more detail some of the stories that Wil is going to share with you. We produce both in-person and online serious games that help stakeholders and customers and partners and essentially people who care about a topic. It provides them a framework for collaboration, and that collaboration results in problem solving and data generation and insights. And so we started out doing these as in-person techniques. And a number of our customers a long time ago said, look, this is great, but we have people all over the world and we want you to do this online. So that led to the development of now 3 platforms that help teams of people collaborate, whether they're in the room or whether they're distributed globally. So I was just telling Wil, I got back from a conference late last night where one of our newer partners called the Kettering Foundation just launched a new platform called Common Ground for Action. And we will take an opportunity to schedule a webinar specifically about that. It's our newest platform that's for strategy development. And so, again, they have the same struggle. They've been helping citizens in the context of forums for years tackle really complex national issues, things like immigration reform. And they have the same goals. In person is great, but it doesn't scale. We want to do this online. So that's what we're specialists in, is designing techniques and platforms that allow people to collaborate around complicated problems. So in terms of what we do with Rackspace, Rackspace is a great example of a company that uses innovation games at all of these phases or stages. So the games that we'll talk about, they fall into these categories of games that help with idea generation, very open-ended thinking. There are a number of games that help with sense making, so that kind of middle phase of shaping ideas into something that are related to the context of the business. And then there are a number of games that help with prioritizing. And, in the cycle of taking action, the whole objective is to be able to take action against what you learn. But in that doing phase, there are also a number of games that help teams produce better results quicker. So in the case of Rackspace, the relationship has been quite a long and lovely one. In fact, Rackspace hosts our platforms, and we're very grateful for the expertise that they can provide us as a hosted platform. So we've done a number of trainings with Rackspace, and Will, I think you've taken one of them that Luke has delivered. The organization as a whole has experience with many of the games, and Will, you're an example of somebody who actually has used a lot of them. And over the course of all these projects, I think what Will be able to talk about is what that planning process was. We always in the class teach people to start with the question of, okay, well, what am I trying to figure out? What don't I know? And if I had that answer, what would I do with it? And that's kind of the starting point for figuring out which game am I going to use, or which series of games will I use, and how will I help my organization or my team actually take action against what we learn. So that's a really quick nutshell of kind of the context of these games. And I think what's great about being able to talk to Will today is that he can describe 4 of the games specifically, and then talk about why he chose them, what problems was he and his team in Rackspace trying to solve, and then what did he learn? What actions were they able to take afterwards? So let's talk about the games at Rackspace. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you. And one of the first games I know you wanted to talk about was Buy a Feature. So why don't you give a quick summary of what the game actually is, and then you can talk about how you used it.
Okay, great. So I've used Buy a Feature probably 6 or 7 times during my time at Rackspace, a couple of times online. Majority of the times have been in person. And one thing that struck me as you talked about, sort of identifying the question, that sort of thing for innovation games. When you've been doing this for a while, it's kind of insidious. You find yourself hearing someone talk about a problem, and then your mind is working on, wow, I could use an innovation game for that, and here's what it is, but you can't really spit that out to the person because they don't necessarily know what innovation games are. So in a sense, it's a little frustrating until you kind of bring them up to speed on how you can potentially help them gain that information from either their customers or their stakeholders or whatever. But you find your mind working in the background on wow, this would be great for an innovation game, and here's the one I'd use. So anyway, just sorry for the rabbit hole there, but Buy a Feature I've used several times for both internal stakeholders and external customers. The latest example, like I mentioned earlier, was at our Customer Advisory Council. The game itself is basically, you can think of it as a menu or a features list. If you have a product that you're making and you have 20 features that have been asked for, but you're not really sure how they should be prioritized, because in many cases, as an internal organization, you'd be apt to prioritize them in a way that makes sense to you and to your development team, but that's rarely ever completely in line with what your customers would like to see, and the sort of order that things and features come out. So it's a really good game to set up a group of customers, usually from 6 to 8, and get them this menu or list of features. To each feature, your team has assigned what they call a t-shirt size, so small, medium, large, extra large, and that can be based on level of effort or cost to complete or whatever. what happens is a dollar value is generated from that t-shirt size so that every feature on the list then has a dollar value. And what you're doing is you're going to have, say you have 6 people in your game, you're going to take your total amount of money that all the features would cost, and you would probably only give the participants in the game 40 to 60% of the actual money they would need to purchase every feature. And then what you do is you start the game off and say, here's your list of features, here's money that each one of you has allocated. You might have money enough to buy a feature that you're interested in, or you might be better off corroborating and collaborating with the other people in the game and purchasing features together. And that's very powerful. And the reason that's powerful is not everyone has an appreciation when they are stuck in their own problem and stuck on their own feature that they want. Not everyone has an appreciation for how other features come into play and how those features could potentially help them. So what's really golden in the data that you get from these is the discussion that happens between the players. In the in-person game, obviously, you need note takers or observers to take this stuff down, because as a facilitator, you're not always able to capture it. But in the online game, it's very easy because this happens via chat, and you have transcripts of the chat, so it's a very good data mining opportunity at the end. As the game progresses, features are bought, and you can sort of catalog what order they were bought in, which is very significant usually. And you can also see which of your customers pooled their resources together to buy which features, and then capture the conversation around that. Well, I really like this feature because it is going to be great for my customers, and here's why. So it's really a rich data gathering experience, because ultimately innovation games in themselves gets people sort of out of their norm of going to a meeting and having to contribute something, but not necessarily being very engaged or thinking about things sort of inside the box. Innovation games themselves get people into more of a fun-loving, I mean, we all love to play games, into a fun-loving environment where we're naturally more creative, and in our interactions with each other, a lot of that creativity and insight that might be hidden in a basic environment, in a creative environment, that all sort of comes to the surface.
One of the things I noticed, Will, in some of the customer advisory councils that I've been involved in, and I'm wondering if it happens to you too, is that when that happens to a person, when they relax a little bit and get interested in what their fellow either colleagues or in the case of an advisory council, obviously they're talking to people from other companies as well. What ends up happening is, while they're talking about what's important to them, they articulate what doesn't matter, and sometimes what they end up revealing, which is really hard to get at, is what are their current workarounds, right? Because, of course, if you can't deliver a feature, they've figured out a way to do it anyway. And that is really interesting when you hear customers share of the ways that they've already figured out how to do something, which may mean they can wait a little longer to get a feature from you. And it's that sharing of insight about, well, how does my infrastructure really work, and how have I really accomplished some of my goals? And all of a sudden, you couldn't get that from a survey. I think you can only get that because you can overhear people figuring it out in the context of the game.
Right, and it's interesting that you brought that up, because I can't count the number of times in my career, dealing with the software development lifecycle, where you're dealing with a vendor that says, oh, we can't do that, that's not, we've thought about it, but we can't do it, it's not possible. And then you talk to somebody else that's using the product who says, oh, yeah, we had that same problem, so we just developed this, this, and this. And then the vendor suddenly becomes interested, because they said, well, since you figured out how to do it, let us know what you did, and we'll put it in the product.
Right,
so
right.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. It's often the converse. It's what they don't like or what they have trouble with that you find out as well, as sort of a side effect of this whole process.
Yeah.
So ultimately, just to finish the thought, at the end you end up with a prioritized list of what your game players have purchased as to what they feel are the most important features. So this is very interesting, because often it's not what you think that they would choose. Sometimes it is, but just the amount of data mining available is pretty staggering.
So if you had to, I mean, obviously you've done a lot of them now. So what evolved in your method of using buy a feature from the very first time you did it to now? I would certainly call you an expert on this, on the platform and this game for sure. So what have you learned over using it so many times that might be useful for the folks listening?
So I think one of the things is just the level of orchestration that you use, right? Because in the beginning, especially when you're new to it, you kind of have a tendency to want to control things a little bit more. This was evident, for example, in the San Jose Budget Games. I had the opportunity to help Luke and his team out with the San Jose Budget Games, which is a nonprofit sort of way for the city of San Antonio San Antonio, that's where I live, San Jose, to decide what items from the budget they spend their money on, and they have real people, from homeowners associations and other places chime in and do this by a feature game and come out with a prioritized list. Orchestration there was a little more important because you have a lot of strong personalities, if you will, that kind of go off on tangents, and if you allow them to go too far off on tangents, then that's not productive. But you really learn after you've done this several times that it's really not stifling that creative process by sort of over-orchestrating it usually gets you better results. So do enough orchestration to keep things within the lines and within the rules of the game, but don't stifle, side discussions, because those are really the things that are going to be interesting to you later.
Yeah, I've heard, we work with a number of really fabulous facilitators, and I know Deb Colden is on the call, so Deb, I'm going to quote you, but one of the things that she would remind us, and now it's become second nature to us as well, is that, the folks that you bring in to do this are all, really smart grown-ups. And what the nice thing that she keeps reminding me is that, hey, the game has rules and structure, and they will figure it out. And you're right, it's more of a hands-off facilitation. It's you provide some guidance, and you might have to answer a few questions about the rules, but it's really an interesting way of letting the participants have the power, because the constraint is already there. The occasional nudging from the facilitator, the rules of the game, how it's set up. So it's almost like, and she says this a lot, it's the preparation. That's where all the work goes in. And once you're there the day of, and your participants are there, and you start the game, that's relaxing. That's fun. That's interesting. You get to hear what they say. It's the preparation is what makes it feel so easy for the people the day of.
Another interesting thing is to call attention to trends that you see going on during the game. So, for example, this last one that we did, there was one particular gentleman who was just hoarding his money. I mean, he wasn't parting with it. He was watching everything else go on, kind of to the tune of, well, I'm going to see all my features get bought anyway by everyone else. I'm not going to spend my money unless I have to. But, it sort of defeats the purpose of the game, right? Because at the end, you're not going to get to keep the money because it's all fake money anyway. So, calling attention to things like that, that people may or may not realize that they're doing, kind of helps the game along and helps spur additional discussions. Because, at that point, I had product managers asking him, was there something else on the list that you're not seeing, and that's why you're not spending your money? So it's often good to pick up on those trends,
Yeah,
and identify them, because they might be significant.
Yep. All right. Well, I want to move on to the second game that is one that I really love as well. The next game that I know you want to talk about is your use of Remember the Future. So if you could just describe real quickly what the unique rule of this particular game is, and then we can talk about how you used it.
Well, the distinction that struck me when I first came into contact with this game was just how rewording a question in a different way can be so significant to really draw out of someone different answers or different results. And what I mean by that is, Remember the Future we used as a way to sort of figure out what our roadmap for our particular team needed to be. And my team right now, we run the Rackspace community, which is an online forums support solution for our customers. So we really sat down, and what you're trying to get out of this game is figuring out what you want to see in the product in the future, right? And you could go up to someone and say, what do you want my product to do? And they would give you a pretty basic, answer, something that just sprang to mind. But if you word it from the standpoint of, okay, transport yourself to 1 year in the future, and what will my product have done to make you happy? So changing their perspective to here and now and thinking maybe of our product's deficiencies to changing it to a year in the future and saying, in your blue sky scenario, what is my product doing for you right now? And that gets you the end state. And then what you can do is work backwards in time slices to figure out how you're going to do that. So for us, it was, okay, I want A, B, C, and D as far as prioritized features, but then we needed to sort of reverse engineer to figure out how we could get there and what dependencies there were and everything else. And it kind of gave us a really good swipe at a timeline for what features come out first that enable other features, et cetera, until you reach that end state.
Yeah, it's an interesting game because when you take away people's concern that it's not possible, because, hey, it happened, right? So if you're working backwards from something that's true, then you still understand where the tough points will be, but people think differently. What they will tell you then as well, to get around this tough point, you will have provided me with this. My organization will have done that. And oh, by the way, this third-party vendor I've never told you about, they're going to need to be on board with this too because they affect our infrastructure in this way. And all of a sudden, it's not a no, we can't possibly do that. It's like, oh, well, because we already did it, these are the hard things we solved in order to get there.
Right, and again, it's another thing that really brings creativity out of people because, to your point, if you take away the, oh, we'll never be able to do that state, and give them the given that it has been done, you might get some crazy ideas on how it could possibly get done, but you might get something that you never thought of before, and it's really where the richness of the data comes out.
Yep, yeah, agreed. Well, let's move on to Speedboat. This is, one of the core games, again, that were written about in the book that Luke, launched years ago. And personally, I feel like it's one of our go-to games. So if you want to just give a quick description of Speedboat and then talk about how you used it, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, so this was one of the original. I think this was the first game that I ever came into contact with. And what was interesting for me, the way it was drawn up on the board is almost into 4 quadrants, and you had the speedboat at the top, and you had anchors, and you have the engine, meaning anchors, meaning things that would inhibit you from doing what you need to do. The engine, things that enable you to do what you need to do. There was sort of the end state that you want to get to.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was also the rocks that you could crash on if things didn't go well. So all that said, you get people to, you just give them a pile of sticky notes and have them come up to put stuff on the board and identify them as an anchor or, an engine or, Nirvana or the rocks, right?
Yeah.
And each idea, at the end you sort of bring them all together and put them in clumps of ones that are very like each other. One of the interesting things about this game is that many times you will get the converse of one item in the other item. So things that speed me up, the converse of those are things that slow me down. But when you don't get that similarity of opposites of each other, or when they're slightly different, you can identify other things that you might not have thought about before. The very subtle things that come to light when people have the ability to have a graphical environment like this where they're being creative. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I've heard that part of that kind of graphical view of it is that the other participants can look at it and say things like, it's interesting. I never looked at it that way. I never thought about it that way, but it reminds me of this. And so the metaphor provides maybe an easier bouncing off point for having a different way of thinking about it. And then you end up discovering something that would have been hard to think about otherwise. It's this kind of collaborative generation of, in some cases, art. Not all boats are beautiful, but some of them end up to be quite interesting. But then it's a way to capture insights that would have been really hard looking at a spreadsheet. So it's fun. Yeah. Have you played the Speedboat online, or has this been primarily an in-person experience for you?
No, it's sadly it's been a primarily in-person experience, and the reason I say sadly is because I'm I can draw lines, I can draw circles, but drawing anything more complicated is kind of a stretch for me. So my speedboats don't necessarily always look particularly good, so I have to often explain what they are. So I think the online game would pretty that up for me, and I need to try it.
Well, it's interesting because I know you've used Speedboat with internal teams a lot, and when we talk with folks who've used the online platform, the reason they do it online is either because their teams are distributed, and so hey, if you've got development teams in India, or you have multiple locations, and getting a conference room is not an option. That's one reason of doing it, and for internal teams, and then for customers, I can't remember what your schedule is for bringing customers in person. But it can't be as frequent as what you'd like to talk to them for, right? So another reason that the online games have been useful is that it lets you talk to people more frequently.
Right. Yeah, I think the current cadence for our customer advisory councils are at least once a year, and then at the half-year point we do something online. So
right.
But you're right. You can never have enough of that kind of input.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I know the last game we wanted to talk about was Product Box, and I just had a little crashing PowerPoint here, which is coming back up again. So while I pull that back up, if you want to talk a little bit about Product Box and how you use that, I think that's the fourth game that we wanted to talk about. And at that point, we'll be opening up to questions. And so if anyone has any questions, now would be a good time to type them into chat while Wil kind of presents the last game that he wanted to talk about.
Yep, Product Box was the second game I learned, and I'll say that I've played it since then. It's been a lot more enjoyable, only from the standpoint of when we were taught to play it, we drew the box in about as 3D condition as we could on the board, and we had sticky notes and people attached the sticky notes. I've since played several times where the materials were there, the actual boxes where you hand them to the customers and give them everything that they could possibly need to be creative, and then they just go to town and create, something crazy where they're putting all the things, if they were buying your product in the store off the shelf, that they would want on the box so that it would make it compelling for them. So, in your example you have right here, you have more puffy goodness for this product puffs, right? So that would be a feature that is important to customers. They wouldn't want to buy it unless puffy and goodness were there. So this is really how you turn your customers loose to their creative side and allow them to come up with just a bunch of crazy things, many of which can translate into good features down the road that you may not have thought of. Some of the boxes that I've seen were very clever, very outlandish, just sort of all over the map. So it really allows their creative side to come out, because they're not just putting Post-it notes on the board. Instead, they're creating things out of clay or to stick to the side of the box. I've seen it all. So it's really what would be on that box that would compel you to buy this product. What would this product absolutely have to have in its ingredients list, if you will, in order for you to buy it. So.
Yeah, I know that this was a game that you used with the globalization effort, and I know this is I don't know if it's top of mind. I didn't warn you I was going to ask you about this, but one of the questions that are coming up is, can you remember anything that came from Product Box that you actually then you could tell it affected the roadmap, or you ended up implementing it, and do you think that you would have, was it due to Product Box or one of the other games that you used, and how did it actually affect the Rackspace roadmap? Is there anything specific that you can talk about?
Well, one thing that was interesting that came out of that effort, and I'm pretty sure it came out of the product box discussion because it was written on the product box, is there is this concept of globalization, especially when you're globalizing an online presence, of not appearing just like an American company doing business in another language, but almost appearing as a company that originated in that culture, whatever it is, right? So I think one of the things that was eye-opening was I don't want to feel like you're an American company just doing business in my country. I want to feel like you're part of it, you know? So that I can't remember exactly how that was stated on the box, but that was kind of eye-opening because it's like, yeah, that makes total sense. If I were a user of Rackspace from some other country somewhere where I for the longest time haven't been able to do business in my native language, and suddenly have the ability to, the whole experience has to be right. It can't just be a translation of online content, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, I guess what you're saying is like I can hit Google Translate to any website I go to. What I want to feel like as a customer is that you get more than just the language piece, like maybe doing business and the things that I need to deliver to my customers. There's nuances there that I want you to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah. So obviously, the use of innovation games in working with customers and working with internal teams is pretty important to Rackspace. I know you have it integrated into the actual physical space that you work in, right? I mean, you have what you call Reactivity rooms, where if somebody wants to run an innovation game, all the materials are there, right?
Yeah, and the funny thing I always joke about the Reactivity room is this, I don't even know what the dimensions on it are, probably 12 by 18 room. It's got a big table in it. It's got whiteboards for walls. It's got these little wheeled compartments that have all the little props in it, fake money for buy a feature, or string, or different colored pens or whatever for product box to stick onto the box. It's just got all that stuff in there. The problem is I think we could have used an innovation game to plan out the construction of the Reactivity room, because the Reactivity room doesn't have a roof. And when you understand the Rackspace workplace having been a mall in its previous life, and knowing that you have people upstairs who can suddenly now make a lot of noise above you while they're looking down at whatever you're doing in the Reactivity room, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a safe environment, if you will, to be your best creative self. So it's almost like you're at the zoo and someone's looking down into your enclosure. So it's ironic that I think we probably could have used an innovation game to help us plan that out before we built it. But it is a pretty cool place that you can rent out if you're here at Rackspace to run one of these games, because it's got everything you'll need.
That's actually great. So you have a room, and so the lessons learned: it needs a roof. Whiteboard for walls are good, and you shouldn't have to leave to go get your kit, right? So.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So how many? Obviously you're doing a lot with innovation games, and I know next week you're going and doing this at a trade show. So I think that's fantastic to kind of run innovation games on the booth and with stakeholders that you have meetings with and things like that. But obviously you're not the only one. I mean, do you have are you going to have help? And do you have other people who are trained to do this? And how many people at Rackspace do this?
I got to apologize. They have a fire drill going on right now. So I can give you a quick answer, and then I'll switch over to my cell phone if that works. There are a bunch of trained facilitators here at Rackspace. There are probably two that have been sort of working with Luke the longest, myself and a gentleman called Tony Wolf.
Mm-hmm.
Tony works remotely out of Seattle now. So I'm going to put you guys on mute for a second and dial in via my cell phone so I can get out of the building.
All right. You know what? Talk about a trooper. So if we get him back on the line, we'll definitely answer a few more questions. We're certainly at the end of the 4 games that Wil uses frequently and wanted to talk about. If there are any other questions, I think you should type them into chat. And one of the things that I'll mention about Rackspace is that they use them as though they're a normal part of work. And so with inside teams, when they're trying to create roadmaps or retrospectives, whether they're in the Agile group or whether they're in other parts of the organization, just thinking about Speedboat as a way to track what's working and what's not has just become a common way to think about improvement. And certainly continuous improvement inside the organization is something that Rackspace is incredibly good at. So the idea that they use them with internal teams is frequently, if not more so than they do with external stakeholders, customers, and partners, I think is really interesting. The utility is in both areas. And I actually have had the pleasure actually of being part of one of their customer advisory board meetings where innovation games were used. And, the energy level throughout that day was just so high. And the customers ended up saying things like, they learned so much, not just that they had an opportunity to tell Rackspace their ideas and what they needed to have them hear, but because of the collaborative nature of the day, they also got very connected with the other people, that came from other customers, their colleagues essentially, and learned a ton about how the other folks used Rackspace and solved various problems. And so they left enriched, basically they left learning more than when they walked in. So that was great for me. So any other questions that people have that either I can answer or that we can have Wil answer when he pops back on the line? If there's anything else, chat them in. Otherwise, what we're going to do is share the link to the recording of this webinar. And if anyone else has questions afterwards, you can certainly email me or you can email Wil. Both of our emails are available. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And I sure wish Wil would jump back on so I could thank him as well. But working with Wil has actually been a huge pleasure. He's an incredibly skilled facilitator and producer and is just incredibly good at that initial question, right? The question of, okay, well, what's my problem and what am I trying to solve or what are you trying to solve? And then picking the right game or the right series of games and putting them together to get the results that either his team needs or an internal customer of his. And he actually helps quite a few teams design innovation games events and helping them, make sense of the data at the end. So he's fabulous. So Wil, thank you so much. I enjoyed it, and thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you at our next webinar.